You think this is perhaps more of a marketing ploy?
Yeah, that's where the skeptic in me thinks it's a little bit more of that. I mean, you never want to underestimate SoftBank, and when it comes to AI and robotics, I think there's a lot of interest, particularly from the capital markets. But the size and the scale seem a little bit trumped up, so to speak. I think, and the timing I would question as well. And that's why I don't think you're seeing the stocks move at all, because investors are just kind of, somewhat immune to these sort of numbers that keep, going up and up, but they're not necessarily, believing that that's going to impact the stocks anytime soon.
I love that you say we're becoming immune to these sorts of numbers. That sort of number was actually articulated by Sam Altman a little bit ago with our own Emily Chang. Just take a listen to Sam's point here.
The interesting question is if we knew how to get $1 trillion right now, which we don't, would we be able to deploy that profitably in the next few years? And I'm not sure about that, but I feel confident we can make $500 billion of value back.
Sam Altman is saying he's confident he can get half of your money back if you give him $1 trillion. So ultimately, are these the right bets to be betting on as an investor in the likely winners? Would you still allocate to TSMC if indeed $1 trillion is talked about in Arizona, for example?
Well, I love TSM personally, and I really like a lot of these AI compute names that are going to facilitate a lot of this expansion into Gen AI. But honestly, I don't think you need the $1 trillion headlines to make these stocks look attractive or compelling. Everything in the near term sounds like the demand for AI tokens and inferencing is rising. NVIDIA is doing a great job of improving the production and output of their new Blackwell server racks, and the cloud hyperscalers who buy all this equipment all seem keen to increase investment as opposed to limit it or slow it down. So yeah, it's great when SoftBank and others talk big picture plans down the road, but I think there's just so much demand and interest near term that investors should be focused, more on that and less on, big scale projects that may or may not come about. Because as your, prior analysts mentioned before this piece, there's a lot of regulation and government involvement that would need to come to pass, even before you can even entertain some of this.
Talking of government involvement, that's perhaps what's in the eye of the storm for investors right now. I'm seeing NVIDIA sort of near session lows at the moment, and others that perhaps make things in China, particularly chips, because there's Wall Street Journal reporting saying that the US might make it even harder to use US equipment in China, the likes of TSMC, SK Hynix, Samsung, for example. How much of a headwind is this for the overall semiconductor space?
Well, it's a great question. I think what you're seeing here is these reports get leaked, or information from the administration gets leaked to the press. They put out stories that talk about potential restrictions that the U.S. could put on our intellectual property, our leading edge equipment and technology that would go either to our allies or anyone related to China. And in my opinion, this is similar to the reports you heard on EDA software being blocked or restricted from China when we were trying to get those rare earth and magnet imports turned back on. So what I think is happening is you have two big Korean memory companies that make memory inside China. And the U.S. wants to get leverage in the current ongoing trade negotiations with South Korea or maybe other Asian nations who would be exposed to these rules. And so they throw this out as, well, we might, restrict the ability to get those leading edge tools, which would basically make those fabs inefficient. It wouldn't shut them down, but if you can't get the best, latest equipment, it basically puts you at a competitive disadvantage versus companies like Micron. So I think it's more posturing and leverage, but it would be it definitely doesn't help the sentiment across semis, and that's to answer your question, because anytime you bring up government restrictions in China, it just puts some downward pressure on semis. But again, I don't necessarily think this is what is going to happen anytime soon. It's just a risk.
Just a risk, but people act on those risks. And as we see the SOX, the semiconductor index, now trading off by 1.7%, and it's KLA, it's Lam Research in particular, in the headwinds. Can you give us a sense of who, despite these sorts of environment, you just have to allocate to because, well, the positives just so outweigh? Does it still remain NVIDIA at all cases, TSMC at all cases? Are there more nuanced plays to be had? Because it feels as though we've been ringing that one for a while.
Well, you mentioned the names that would be most at risk would be the equipment companies, KLA, ASML, potentially AMAT and Lam. And those stocks have been going up in the face of a lot of concern that the U.S. could put further restrictions on those equipment and that those tools going into China. So a lot of the people I speak to are already cautious on the equipment stocks. But what I actually think, it definitely really won't impact NVIDIA, in my opinion. TSM, honestly, again, demand exceeds supply. They're going to do fine. And the other name that I would look at, as you mentioned, like who could benefit, is Micron. So Micron is the other large DRAM NAND flash memory supplier, and they don't have big factories inside China. They're the only U.S. memory company, so they're like our leading champion, and we want them to survive and do well, and obviously they're going to try to move more of their manufacturing into the United States, but they would be at an advantage if the U.S. was to restrict Samsung and Hynix from getting those needed tools in those Chinese facilities. And that's the one that's reporting next week. That's the one I think that's going to sound super bullish on demand for memory in AI. And that's the one I think that could really be the surprise upside winner.